Last week, we saw an unprecedented fracturing in our relationship with Israel. It started when Australia said it would recognise a Palestinian state, and then escalated when Tony Burke announced he cancelled the visa of Israeli politician Simcha Rotman. For more on this, I'm joined by former Deputy Prime Minister, podcast extraordinaire, and general amazing statesman, John Anderson. John, thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of everything we've seen in the last week?
Freya, great to be with you. Look, what we've seen is a continuation on of a mess that has arisen because we don't know our history, we don't believe in our culture, we have no particular attachment to democracy, and we are ignoring Bob Hawke's warning. Bob Hawke was a very educated man and a very insightful man. He made the observation that when the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. And it is a truism, I have a great interest in history, as you know, that so far as I'm aware, no country that has turned its back on Israel now, I suppose you'd say, but more particularly the Jewish people down through the ages, has ever prospered. The obvious and outstanding example is the way the German people turned on the Jewish people during the Second World War. Now, that was genuine genocidal intent. It, of course, stripped out of Germany such decency as ever might have existed in an otherwise civilised country, and resulted, in many ways, was one of the major factors behind Germany being reduced to a smouldering rubble. Bob Hawke knew what he was talking about. Unfortunately, we now live in an age when not many of our leaders do. Now, having said that, I think the Israeli ambassador had a good point. Let's take the temperature out of this. In the end, we have far more to gain by maintaining a relationship with a vibrant democracy, which is under enormous challenge in the Middle East at the moment. That should be obvious. And I'd make the point that it's no irony that it appears that many, many of the other surrounding countries are essentially hardly supporting Palestine, whereas we are.
Exactly. Well, when Netanyahu called Albanese weak and said he turned his back on Australian Jews, Tony Burke went on the ABC and said this.
Strength is not measured by how many people you can blow up or how many children you can leave hungry.
John, that is so out of line.
Well, you know, is strength marching in, raping, murdering, cutting heads off babies, throwing them into microwave ovens, dragging semi-naked, dead German Jewish ladies around the streets to cheering Gazans? You know, is that strength? Is that character? Is that moral? Or is it barbarous? And should we recognise that if we were in a position, if we had a neighbour who'd done this, a terrorist outfit, we would be clamouring for our government to solve the problem as well. And a government that did not look after the security of its people, I think would be a government that was out of order you couldn't have any confidence in. The other great point about it is that it's highly offensive to make that accusation of the IDF. If you want to criticise the governance of Israel, the government, the Prime Minister of Israel, by all means do so. But I don't think it's fair. In fact, I think it's right out of order for him to attack the IDF in what was highly emotive language.
Exactly. And one of the things that struck me is that a lot of the comments and the general approach that Labor has taken to this whole issue just screams of a government that has never actually had to confront jihad as terrorism themselves. They've never had to fight a war. In fact, we're hopelessly unprepared for a war. It is a government that cares more about virtue signalling to its own base and potentially winning a few extra votes in Western Sydney than actually standing up for what's right.
Freya, I never thought I would say the day, or find the day would come when I have to say in some ways I'm deeply ashamed of my own country, that we should be turning Australia into a place where the Jewish people who have contributed so much, and in fact most of whom came here because of the unbelievable oppression and suffering that they were subjected to in Europe in the 30s and 40s, that they no longer feel that this is a place where they're appreciated and can feel safe. I am staggered that Australia's reached this point. I go back to what Bob Hawke said. Every culture and society down through the ages that's turned its back on the Jewish people, it's fallen prey to the oldest form of racism, and racism is hatred, basically, at its heart. They've never done well out of it. It's a terrible mistake. And I do think the point that Bob Hawke was making, and we need to make it now, it's not just Israel that's under threat. It's our own culture, because we're not thinking critically. We're not understanding our history. We are not understanding where the real moral compass lies here. And again, I go back, it's one thing to criticise the Israeli government. It's another thing to hide your anti-Semitism behind that. And there's plenty of people doing that. You know, if we were really only purely concerned about the unfortunate scenes we're watching there, why are we not saying that those responsible for the great evils in Syria, what are they doing to feed their victims?
Yeah.
You go to Tibet, go and have a look at what's happening in Myanmar. Why are there no bridge marches about those people and actually the much larger numbers of casualties that are taking place there? Why would we not remember our own history? You know, I think some 5 million German citizens died as the Allies sought to crush the evils of Nazism. 5 million. Are we saying we should have stopped that campaign and allowed the Nazis to rebuild? Let's bring some balance and some understanding in this. And I say that as somebody who is beginning to think that perhaps Mr. Netanyahu might pull back. Perhaps he has achieved his objectives. That is a serious subject about which we can talk. But let's talk in an intelligent and understanding way. Stop this juvenile critical thinking, that's driving this stuff, that somehow this is about oppressors and colonists. That just doesn't stack up to a moment's examination for anyone who understands anything about the Middle East.
And I think what we've seen since October 7, even the day after, less than 24 hours after October 7, we saw those horrendous marches down to the Opera House. I think we've seen certain cracks in our society that have become gaping chasms. And the ABC reported this week that a convicted ISIS recruiter was actually at the Harbour Bridge rally with anti-Semitic hate preacher Wissam Haddad. And it's alleged that they were trying to use the pro-Palestine movement as a way to get people into radical Islam. And that's the other factor that is underlying this whole movement. What kind of agendas are trying to latch onto the pro-Palestine movement, whether they be on the extreme left or radical Islam? It's clear that there are many actors trying to use this almost as a Trojan horse to spread a deeper and far more nefarious message.
Well, good on the ABC for exposing this. You know, I'm delighted that they have, because I see show after show after show on SBS and ABC where they refuse to hammer Hamas and identify their responsibilities for this, and the fact that they withdrew from the peace process, you know, when a whole lot of Western countries basically fell prey to their propaganda and said, let's have a two-state solution. But why should we be surprised? Why are well-meaning Australians, I'm sorry to have to say this, but what are you doing lining up on the bridge when you've got people like this who are obviously manipulating it? Why are you aligning yourself with them? Why not go and have a genuine March for Humanity? Because, in effect, what you've got here is a lot of people who are, if you like, Islamists in the sense that it's a political movement as much as it is a religious belief system, who are seeking a radically different form of government in Australia. And we had not only pictures of that horrendous figure of evil, Ayatollah Khomeini, being held up with a certain former Premier of New South Wales close by. There were Taliban flags there. How do you think our servicemen who went to try and defeat the Taliban, in no small part, so that the women and children, by the way, of Afghanistan might actually be able to go to school, might be safe, might actually be able to find a life for themselves. And here we are, in the name of a March for Humanity, lining up with people like that? No, you know, this is a serious issue for the West as much as it is for Israel. Let us make no mistake about it. We are losing our ability to think clearly. We have jettisoned our history, and we are not thinking things through clearly. We're creating a void into which really dangerous and convictions, if you like, convictions are flowing in. Our lack of conviction is creating an environment where people with very strong convictions that ought to be receiving a lot more scrutiny, are flowing quite freely. And I find that really troubling.
And just quickly before we go, if this is what diversity looks like, has multiculturalism failed?
I think multiculturalism is essentially now failing because what we can see is that in the name of trying to be nice to everybody else, we've turned ourselves inside out, trying to give voice to ideas that are so essentially hostile to our underlying values, the things that made our culture attractive for other people to want to come to, that we, it's beginning, shall we say, to fail the pub test in Australia. And we do need to stop and say our culture matters. It really matters. I learnt the other day of a Vietnamese man who came here with his family. He said to his two boys, right, you go to school. I want you to be great Australians. We wanted to come here for years. We've got here. Now we want to help keep it great and make it great in the future. Kids are coming home from school saying, oh, Dad, this isn't a great country at all. We're learning at school that it's an illegitimate country.
Exactly. So sad. And it's right through our education system. John Anderson, thank you so much for your time this evening.